The disciples of Jesus, his earliest followers, are 2 days from Friday, and Friday was the worst day. It's hard to believe that a week before Friday, everything was wonderful. They had walked into Jerusalem as a group in the middle of a spiritual earthquake, the epicenter of it, that had begun the moment that Jesus, we're told, stood in front of the tomb of his friend Lazarus, the tomb of his friend 3 days in the grave. He'd said in a confident voice, "Lazarus, come out." And Lazarus, like a man taking an afternoon stroll, had walked out of the grave to cheers and celebrations. That moment began something as they walked into Jerusalem. Lazarus' name and Jesus' name were on everybody's lips. The disciples had celebrated as Jesus' greatest opponents. The Pharisees had exclaimed, "The whole world has gone after him. We've lost this battle. Everything is going to change now." They'd watched as young kids had danced in the streets, had thrown palms and cloaks on the dusty Jerusalem floor. Jesus had walked into Jerusalem like a conquering hero. In fact, he'd rode on a donkey. And he has this moment where in Jerusalem, the road splits. One half goes to the Fortress Antonia, the seat of power where all the Roman rulers would have stayed. There's this moment where he can take this huge procession, this groundswell of support, and he can take it, and he can walk into the most powerful place, and he can take control of this city. And the disciples are waiting for this moment where Jesus will proclaim himself to be king, and they, as his closest followers, will have these positions of power. And Jesus stops, and it's like he's contemplating these two different possibilities. The one road goes down to the Fortress Antonia where he can become king, and the other road goes upwards. It goes up to the temple, to the spiritual center of Jerusalem, maybe the spiritual center of the world. And Jesus pauses, stops, and then they begin this walk up to the temple. And Jesus will stand there in front of all these people, this huge groundswell of support, these people that want to make him king. And he'll say this: "Unless a seed falls into the ground and dies, it remains just a seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds." In the moment of victory, in the moment where everything can be changed, Jesus is talking about death. And from that moment, everything goes wrong. Suddenly, they're hidden away throughout the whole of the festival that's taking place in Jerusalem. Suddenly, they're doing hidden, quiet meals, just the group of them, and then late at night, they flee off to a favorite prayer spot. And these disciples watch as this leader, this charismatic rabbi, who they have come to love and adore, seems to lose all of his confidence. Suddenly, he's the one that's praying on the floor, desperate for something to change. He's the one that we're told sweats tears of blood. And these disciples watch as their leader seems to lose all ability to lead. The rest of the story, most of you will know. There's the arrest, there's betrayal, there's trial, there's crucifixion, there's death. And then think of these men that have followed Jesus. There's this moment where they, on Saturday, are stuck in this room, just waiting. If there's anything worse than Friday, maybe it's Saturday. Maybe it's this moment where you're all alone. You don't know what's happening next. You're waiting for these powerful Roman soldiers to come and mop up what's left of this insignificant rebellion. Every footstep outside the door you fear, every knock on the door, you think, what is next? The best case scenario is that you and your followers, you sneak off back to your old jobs. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is they round you up and it's all over. For these earliest followers of Jesus, everything in that moment that Jesus started talking about death, instead of taking control as king, everything started to go wrong. And so they sit on Saturday and they wait, and Saturday is slow and it takes forever. And finally, Saturday moves to Sunday. And still these disciples, they sit. Fortunately for the story, there's 3 women that have followed Jesus everywhere, and they're braver than the men that have followed him. Early in the morning, it says that they get up and they start to walk to the tomb. What do they expect to find? We don't know. They take linens, they take perfumes, they're going to do a duty. This isn't something that they want to do, it's something they feel in their hearts that they have to do. They have to take care of this master that they followed everywhere, who's changed their lives. So they go to do those last rites, to embalm the body, to perfume it, and then to leave it in the tomb. What they expect to find, we don't know. How they expect to move this giant stone that's been placed in front of his borrowed tomb, we don't know. But they get there and the stone is gone. And there's this moment where they walk towards the entrance to the tomb and see that it's empty. And for just this one moment, the greatest miracle the world will ever know is held in the hands of 3 women who may well be too scared to tell anybody what they've seen and won't be believed if they do. This is the resurrection moment that we land in this morning. Good morning, friends. If you're visiting, my name's Alex. I'm one of the teaching pastors here at OneChurch. We're so delighted that you chose to join us on this highest and best day of the year, the moment we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. If you got the cheap seats over at the back today, then we apologize. We threw out what we had, and you're there. The air conditioning is now on. We didn't expect to have to do it in April in New York, but we've done it. So eventually you should feel that beautiful, cool waft of air, and you'll enjoy the rest of the service. Resurrection Sunday is the highest and best day of the year. But it's also a day just filled with mystery. So we're going to unpack some of what happens, what some of Jesus' earliest followers experienced, because the Bible is this wonderful book. It tells us details. Rarely, though, does it tell us emotion. It rarely tells us how people felt. And so one of the things I'd like us to do today is just to be able to unpack a little bit some of that emotion and the reaction of Jesus' earliest followers to exactly what took place in Jerusalem. So let's pray together before we get into what we're going to look at. God, we thank you for this moment, for Resurrection Sunday, the moment where we're told that everything could change. Things that we thought to be impossible are not impossible. They are possible. With you, all things are possible. God, for those of us that are still walking that early journey of faith, we're not sure what to believe or how to believe it, thank you that you welcome us just like those earliest disciples, exactly where we are. It doesn't matter that we're not sure we can believe. You accept us anyway. Help us to walk towards you, God, in faith today. Amen. Unless a seed falls into the ground and dies, it remains just a seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. This is what Jesus told his earliest followers in those moments before his crucifixion. Why is Jesus talking about seeds and death at all? Think about a seed for a second, if that's not too weird to imagine yourself from the seed's perspective. If you have a kid, we've got some sunflower plants over at the back for them to grow, because seeds to me are this fascinating thing. Think about this process. From a seed's point of view, it's taken and it's simply placed into this pot, and the dirt is covered over. It's darkness. It's nothing. If the seed had any feelings, it's this process of just, I'm in the ground. It's all over for me. And then something happens, which the seed obviously can't possibly understand. There's this moment where something in the universe, some force, some bigger thing than the seed, it starts doing something. And then the impossible begins to happen. The germination takes place. And suddenly the seed isn't dead and buried. The seed was simply planted. And that creates all of these incredible possibilities. The Romans were brilliant at killing people. It was what they did best. All throughout their huge empire, which at its high point stretched from England all the way over to India and all the way down to Africa, they executed thousands of people. It was a great way to stop anybody rebelling against you. Throw them up on a cross, they would die slowly and painfully, and then no one else would make the same mistake again. They did this thousands of times. They were wonderfully efficient at it. If Jesus had just stayed dead like every other person they had killed, there would be no story today. There weren't stories about miraculous recoveries. There weren't stories about people that the Romans executed and didn't get it quite right that day. The Romans made massive mistakes in justice, but they never made mistakes in execution. They were brilliantly efficient at killing people. And they expected Jesus to stay dead in just the same way. All the things we hear connected to that story, the fact that they put a sign over his head saying, King of the Jews, that wasn't them saying that Jesus was special. That was them saying, if we did this to your king, imagine what we'll do to you. They expected Jesus to stay dead with the same monotony that everybody else stayed dead. Jesus' life in that moment is a miracle that they did not expect. Sometimes we think that people in the first century were far more naive than us, maybe far more superstitious than us. And in some ways they were, but they still didn't expect people to come back to life. Again, the dead stayed dead with the same monotony in the first century as they did today. They were brilliant at killing people. And we, I think, weirdly, even as followers of Jesus, which many of us are in the 21st century, we tend to focus on the death part, don't we? We tend to focus on Friday, we tend to focus on crucifixion, which no doubt is this incredibly important event. But when you think about it, it's a little bit weird. We put crosses on our walls. Many of you will carry them around your neck today. Would you carry an electric chair around your neck? Would you put a picture of a guillotine on your wall, a gas chamber, as a poster? You wouldn't, would you? The fact that we celebrate Jesus' death in itself is an incredible thing. But if he had just simply died, he would have been forgotten like every other person that those Romans killed. Thousands and thousands of them, efficiently, quickly forgotten, never to be remembered again. Jesus talks about death in a way that there's possibilities to come afterwards. One of Jesus' other biographers says that he added something else to that whole, if a seed falls into the ground and dies. What he said was this. He looked at the temple and he said, see this building? One day it will all fall down. The Pharisees, the other religious leaders, questioned that. They said, we built this, over years. It's a very important building. It seems that the writers about Jesus believed he was talking about his body. He looked at them confidently and said, tear down this temple, this body, and in 3 days, I'll put it back together again. Of course, nobody around him really believed him, but something spectacular was taking place. In 1932, in Game 3 of the World Series, George Herman Ruth, the great Bambino, the Sultan of Swat, we're told, takes 2 pitches. He gets a load of hassle from the benches opposite. They're giving him some chatter. They're winding him up. And so Babe Ruth, apparently in this moment of supreme confidence, we're told, takes his right hand and he points out into center field. The 3rd pitch comes in and Babe Ruth proceeds to hit the ball 490 yards in the exact direction that he just pointed to. It's this moment of athletic supremacy. It's this moment of an athlete in his absolute prime, a moment of an athlete saying exactly what he's going to do before he does it. Not many people can achieve that kind of brilliance. But the kind of brilliance that Babe Ruth achieved pales in comparison to what Jesus of Nazareth does. In this moment where he says, destroy this body, and in 3 days, I'll be back. This is this moment of confidence. This is this moment that these earliest followers of Jesus, these women, have walked into. This moment of an empty tomb that followed certain death. 2 of the women were told, dash off to start reporting the news. One of them, Mary Magdalene, just stays in this moment. I don't know what her emotions were. What does she believe at that time? She sees an empty grave, but she's not seen Jesus. There's this moment of hope filled with loads of doubt as well. What is the next thing for her? This death, this resurrection is a mystery. Think about Jesus in his moment of death. We're told in this passage in a book called Hebrews that Jesus was tempted in every way that human people were. Now, I'd like to think that, or I would read in the Bible, that Jesus' biggest temptation was to doubt. When you think about the story about the Garden of Gethsemane, you feel him in his moment of doubt. When you read the stories about Jesus, it says he goes out into the wilderness. It seems that the devil, this character, comes to him and tempts him. Are you really the Son of God? In the moment that he's on the cross, everyone around him says, if you're really who you are, who you say you are, come down. Come down and change everything that way. It seems there's always these questions at him. Are you really who you say you are? Are you really who you say you are? And then on that moment, there's that moment where Jesus cries out, Telestai, it is finished. And then he breathes his last. For Jesus, that moment must have been the biggest challenge to his proclamation that kill me and I'll come back from the dead. Because think about it from Jesus' point of view. There's that last breath, and then you're placed in the ground, and you're covered up. Suddenly it's darkness. This is now a faith statement. And then something way up there, some bigger thing, calls down to this broken body of Jesus lying in the dirt that's dead and buried. And it begins to speak, and it begins to bring new life, and something takes place. And in that moment, just like a seed, it turns out that Jesus wasn't buried. He, like the seed, he was simply planted. And when you're planted, there's a possibility that new life can spring out of that moment. That resurrection moment is the moment that Mary Magdalene experiences, and she waits with all of this hope, all of this anticipation. And out of the corner of an eye, she catches sight of a man that she believes to be a gardener. She says to him, "Where have you taken my Lord's body? Where has he gone?" And she thought he was a gardener. In a sense, she was right about him being a gardener. When you read the beginning part of this book, the Bible, which is really many books, and some of you may be completely unfamiliar with it, and that's okay. The first book is a book called Genesis. It simply means beginnings. And what it wants to do is help us understand the earliest roots of humanity. The stories like the Garden of Eden, you might take them completely literally, that's wonderful. You might see them as analogous, that's okay. Two, it's this sense of where do we come from as a group of people? And in the Garden of Eden, what we're told is God makes people like you and I, and he makes us in his image. There's things about us that are similar to the way that God is. We're given this huge responsibility. It says we're there to tend to this garden, to look after the other things, to help it grow in the way that it should. It's not supposed to be static and unchanging. It's supposed to spread and become something bigger. And we're given this huge responsibility that it seems humanity rejects. It refuses to do, to be what it could be. Instead, we oppress those that need our help. Instead, we damage the world that we're given to look after. We reject the opportunity to do what God made us to do. That was our role, to be gardeners. When someone programs a computer, I understand just a little about computer programming, they quite often create something called a backdoor, which enables you to get into the computer program system if it gets messed up by idiots like you and I who don't know what they're doing. And what happens is the computer programmer can then jump in and take over, and he can provide a fix that creates new life in the program. Jesus coming into the world is some way analogous to that. It's this moment where God, in all his wonderfulness, steps into humanity and decides, I'm going to help fix this situation. If this guy, Adam, that we read about in the Garden of Eden, is the first gardener, Jesus is this second gardener that comes to fix everything. So when Mary says he's the gardener in some weird, bizarre way, he is right. Jesus has come to recreate this perfect world that God came to give us, or God chose to give us. Jesus is, in some weird way, this gardener figure. And Mary, in that moment, sees this Jesus that she has come to know and love. Mary's story is broken. Mary's story is one of horror. Mary's story is one of suffering. And Jesus has fixed that for her. The fact that he is alive again, that changes everything for her. These are these moments, these emotions that resurrection creates in the first followers of Jesus. But what does resurrection mean for us? Theologians have spilt blood and ink over figuring this out. For some people, it's just simply a release from a debt that we're told that we owe to this God because he gave us these lives and we've wasted them in living in a way that he wouldn't have us live. Imagine you're in a situation, you live in a beautiful home, you have everything that you want, but then you lose your job, everything starts to go south, the situation starts to get worse. Suddenly conversations about which new car should we buy have become conversations that are centered around, could we get 0% on a credit card and maybe move some of our debt over somewhere else? Suddenly you're selling things that have value to you, and suddenly the cupboard that used to be full of food, suddenly there's less and less to live on. There's these moments where maybe you're pulling your kids out of the private school that they've been to, and they're now going to public school that you didn't want them to go to. There's this change of lifestyle, there's this sense of loss, and you see these numbers mounting up, and you're not sure that you can ever dig yourself out of this hill that you've created for yourself. This experience of debt is common to modern people, right? And then imagine in the middle of those late night conversations with your husband or wife, partner, those conversations trying to figure out what to do next. You hear a knock on the door and a neighbor's standing there. In reality, you don't want to speak to anyone right now. You'd rather they would just leave you alone. But this is a neighbor that won't take no for an answer. They almost insist on coming in. And so grudgingly, you just make them some coffee and you sit, and the neighbor starts to talk and says, tell me about the situation. And of course, you're a private person. You don't want to tell them how bad it is, but you start to release some of the details, and slowly you start to talk, and they're like, yeah, I know, but tell me really, what is the situation? How bad is it really? And so more and more details come out. You start to reveal just how much debt you've got yourself into, how awful it's gotten. And that neighbor looks at you and asks this most important question, how much do you need? And you start to think through what you need to make all your obligations this month and how much you can pay just to meet the minimum payment on all those credit cards and get the mortgage paid and maybe buy some food. And the neighbor says, no, I didn't ask you how much do you need for the month. How much do you need completely? And you look as the neighbor pulls out a checkbook and starts to write the figure that you've mentioned, and then just in this moment of just joy and this moment of exuberance, the neighbor looks at you and says, do you know what, I'm just going to add a 0 onto the end of this just to make sure everything's okay for good. This is this like scenario of release of debt that's unexpected, and this is the picture that the Bible paints about what Jesus was doing through death and resurrection. On one hand, there is just that sense of like, Jesus died to pay our debt that we couldn't pay in this exuberant way. But there's also this other story that we sometimes forget, that on some level, Jesus' death was this shout of victory, this defeat of the worst enemy, death. Because we talked about Friday as being one of those worst days. We talk about death as being that worst thing. To a whole wing of the church, there's this Western church that we experience, but there's this whole sort of thing over in the East called the Eastern church, and to them they talk about resurrection as victory. That they sing at this time of year, Christ is risen from the dead, trampling over death by death on those in tombs, bestowing life. To them, resurrection isn't just about paying debt. It's about a shout of victory that says God has defeated the ultimate enemy. Resurrection means that the last thing isn't the worst thing. The worst thing is the next to last thing. And the thing that comes afterwards is this wonderful shout, this welling up of joy in the hearts of people just like you and I that says there is a new possibility, there is a new future. In those worst moments in our life when we go into the ground and it feels like everything covers up and it gets very dark, we feel dead and buried. Resurrection says in those moments you're not dead and buried, just like Jesus, you're simply planted, and that when that happens, there's this possibility that new life can come out from that moment and everything can be different. A few days after the resurrection, Jesus' earliest disciples have gone back to what they know, which is usually in grief, I think. They go back to fishing, and we're told that they stood there fishing, and a voice shouts from the beach, "Come and have some breakfast." What I love about the resurrection of Jesus is it's not ghostly kind of appearances. It's not those kind of weirdly supernatural things. It's concrete things like breakfast on the beach, eggs Benedict, coffee, and orange juice. It's these real hard things, these things you can grasp hold of. Jesus' resurrection for them was this real, physical thing. And in those moments, we don't know what takes place in that conversation really, but in those moments, they're given this new hope that everything that they dreamed could, in fact, be possible. Jesus' death is the worst moment. His resurrection is the best moment. And the best evidence of that resurrection is these 12 men who on Saturday are stuck in a room not knowing what to do, so scared they allow the women with them to go out and do the investigative work. These 12 men who have no future left, who have been taken from around this lakeside, this sea that Jesus now meets them on again, who have been taught all of these different things, who have not known what to believe about this rabbi that they're following, have been confused more than they've understood. These 12 men, a few days after the resurrection, are suddenly on fire with a message that they say has changed them and that can change people like you and I as well. For the next 20, 30, 40, 100, 1,000 years, people just like them went to every part of the world sharing this message, and they went and faced death and suffering with smiles on their faces because they believed in this moment that Jesus died and was buried. He wasn't really buried, he was simply planted, and that new life had shot out from that moment, and that message changed everything. People just like you and I, with our fears, our worries, our concerns, suddenly are captivated by the idea that the worst thing isn't the last thing. It's the next to last thing. And that the last thing is the best thing. It's this moment of resurrection. And to us, we get to celebrate it, yes, as a payment of debt. Yes, as an exuberant writing of extra zeros onto the end of the check, which will cover everything forever. But it's also a shout of victory that says that this life isn't the only thing. That God has not given up on this world that he made, that through people like you and I, he is reshaping it, through people that are working with women in Kenya, having them so felt together to give new opportunities. He's reshaping this world. Through people that are willing to feed people, who are willing to stand up against oppression, he's changing this world. He hasn't given up on it yet. And this world is not dead and buried. In its moments of darkness, it's simply planted. And that new life can come from those possibilities. So what we want to do to celebrate this Easter as a community of people is we want to celebrate with this thing that Christians have done for thousands of years. And again, if you're still figuring out that faith journey, feel free to say no to it. This time we do an open communion thing here, so anybody can come and take it. We're not going to question you as to your standing with the church or anything like that, but you can come and you can take it. And you can do that as a contemplative moment where you realize that you need forgiveness from debt, that there is stuff that you have done in your life that has been against that image of God that he created. And you can ask forgiveness and know that God in his joy and his love writes exuberant zeros on the ends of checks. And you can also come and take it as a celebration of victory. And remember that the God of the universe has not given up on you, has not given up on me, has not given up on this world, but is still fighting for it in incredible ways that were not expected. So we're going to do that together on the night that Jesus died. It says that he gathered with his closest followers. He took bread and he broke it. And he said, "This is my body broken for you." He took a cup and he drank and said, "This is my blood shed for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Remembrance that doesn't always have to be a somber, contemplative moment, but remembrance that can ring like a shout of victory. Knowing that Christ said, "I have defeated death," on those in the tombs, bestowing life. So we're going to take of the communion elements together. Jesus, thank you for your presence with us on this Easter Sunday. Thank you for the bigness of your story, the fact that you, out of death, bring life, out of seeds buried in grounds, you bring new life. as we take these, God, the debts we owe, thank you that you forgive. The life we need, thank you that you bestow. Meet us at the point of our need as we celebrate today.